Good afternoon. I'm Rick O'Donnell, and I help lead ACTA's accreditation reform efforts. In my day job, I'm Chief Revenue Officer at the Fullbridge program, which offers intensive and immersive skill-based programs to teach college students everything they didn't learn in college but that employers want. And the title of our panel today is called Less Interference, which begs the question of interference by whom? And by that we mean accreditors, accrediting agencies. And so I wanted to take a minute and just talk a little bit about who are accreditors and who are accrediting agencies. Let's see if this works. Oh, there we go. So there are 6 regional accreditors. These are probably the most important accrediting agencies to most colleges and universities. Many of them started over a century or more ago as peer association, a group of colleges coming together to discuss self-improvement and how they could get better. And between 1952 to 1965, they became empowered by the federal government to be reliable authorities on the quality of our institutions of higher education. There are also 52 national accrediting associations, and they are the alphabet soup of acronyms. Most of them look at specific type of vocational or technical colleges or other specialized colleges. They technically have the same authority as regional accreditors, meaning they are able to say who gets or does not get access to federal Title IV funding, but they're a little bit the ugly stepchild in the accrediting world because in many states and institutions, academic credits don't transfer unless they come from an institution that is regionally accredited, not an institution that is nationally accredited. And then there are also many discipline and sector-based accreditors, and this is just a sampling. There's an accrediting agency for business schools. The American Bar Association accredits law schools. There's an accreditor for teacher education colleges, and there's an accreditor for forestry programs. And we may hear a little bit later from our panelists that what big universities face is multiple accreditors. They have a regional accreditor, they have discipline accreditors, all on campus making demands, looking at the quality, and it can lead to a costly and burdensome effort when you look at all the accreditors as a whole. So why does this matter? Well, accreditors matter because they are the gatekeeper to federal money. Now, we all have read and heard about how much federal money flows to the for-profits, and it is a lot of money. $8 billion in 2012 to the University of Phoenix, $861 million to DeVry. That is in the form of Pell Grants, federally backed student loans, and other aid. But it is big at other institutions. At public 4 years, Penn State, $550 million. And this is not federal research funding. This is just money tied to students. University of Texas, $275 million. At our community colleges, the numbers are smaller, but what's interesting here is that for many community colleges, federal funding is 40 to 60% of all revenue coming in the door. And at private institutions, University of Southern California, $372 million. Columbia, where we're at today, $246 million. And so this is why accreditation matters, because it is the spigot to a lot of money that for most institutions, they would not be able to survive without it. For institutions with very little endowment, if they were cut off from federal funding, it would basically mean the doors would close. The problem with this, however, is that accreditation and the way accreditors are run is worse than regulatory capture. I used to, at one point, have the Public Utilities Commission in Colorado report to me, and the definition of regulatory capture is the lobbyists from the telephone companies and the utility company would try and wine and dine you, and there was a revolving door of public utility commissioners would go work for the utility, then they get back appointed to the commission. Accreditation is worse than that, because accreditors and accrediting agencies are funded and owned by the people they regulate. So the salaries and the income of the accrediting agencies paid for by the schools, and then the very people who stand to benefit from all that federal funding, the faculty, the administrators, are the same people who go out and approve schools to be eligible for federal funding. So the system has a self-perpetuating vested interest in making sure that basically anything goes and schools never get cut off from the federal spigot. And just a couple of quick things, then we're going to turn to the panelists. So the title of this panel is Interference, and I just want to give you a couple of examples. So the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, WASC, have done a couple of things. The University of California Regents were concerned about runaway administrative costs, and yet their accreditor got on the board's case because they were harsh with the administrators. Now, people's definition of harsh may be in the eye of the beholder, but they weren't questioning runaway costs, but they were questioning the demeanor in which a board of regents decided to talk to its administrators, the people who technically work for the board. This was not the first time. WASC is a little bit infamous. It went after one college for its great books curriculum. It's recently gone after the University of Hawaii for how it decided to select its athletic director. Nothing to do with academics. Another example, SACS, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. Florida Governor Rick Scott has no shortage of opinions about higher education, and he has no qualms about expressing them. He publicly suggested that the president of A&M Florida might want to be suspended after a hazing death of a student. At another time, the governor weighed in on who he thought might be the best president for the University of Florida. That did not sit well with SACS, who publicly criticized the governor and told him to butt out. But what they are basically saying is the CEO of the state of Florida shouldn't be allowed to publicly comment on matters involving a state entity. And then a final example would be SACS again with the University of Virginia, which, whether it was done poorly or not in the firing and subsequent rehiring of President Teresa Sullivan, Virginia law gives the Board of Governors at UVA the right to hire and fire a president. And yet SACS once again disagreed and intervened and wanted to sanction the university for how its board decided to handle its matters. Those are just a few examples. Finally, what's most gratifying for those of us with ACTA who've been working on it is a decade or more ago, ACTA was a little bit of a lonely voice in the wilderness calling for reform of accreditation. But over the succeeding decade, more and more voices have joined. People, including some of our panelists, have written books on this issue. And today, I think there is a growing and emerging consensus that accreditation is broken. I'm not sure there's yet consensus on what should replace it, but ACTA is hard at work trying to make that happen. So we're now going to turn to our panelists. I'm pleased to be joined by three wonderful people. We have Paul Gaston, who is Trustees Professor at Kent State and author of Higher Education Accreditation. Clara Lovett, the former president of Northern Arizona University, who was also ACTA Scholar-in-Residence. And Hank Brown, former U.S. Senator and president of both the University of Northern Colorado and the University of Colorado. We're going to start with Paul and ask for your thoughts on maybe what's working and not working in accreditation.
Thanks very much. And first, I'd like to thank Ann Neal for inviting me to take part in this terrific conversation. The morning was wonderfully stimulating. I'm sure, given the introduction you've given us, the afternoon will be equally stimulating. I've been following the leadership of ACTA for quite a while and found this morning and many other times so much common threads. If you ever have the chance to glance at my AAC&U publication, this is not about accreditation, but about general education and liberal learning, you will sense just how deeply I was resonating with the themes of the morning. I also resonate with your concern about what I would describe as a dramatic deficit in intentionality in the curriculum. And I often speak to faculties by pointing out that the level of intentionality they bring to the curriculum would not get them a moment's attention from an editor if they wrote their scholarly articles with those same standards. I mean, if they began a scholarly article by saying, I'm not going to clarify the intent or the outcomes that I'm seeking in this article, I'm not going to organize it strategically, and I'm not going to measure those outcomes, you wouldn't get past the editor's desk. So that's often leads to a very interesting discussion. But my role this afternoon is to provide a succinct overview of accreditation and to help define some of the issues, perhaps to complement this very succinct presentation of the issues surrounding accreditation. In the book that was mentioned, I attempt to describe how accreditation evolved in the past century and how it has responded or failed to challenges that have emerged in this century. My title suggests that I believe accreditation does have, in many ways, a good story to tell. I don't agree that it's broken. I think the cracks are fairly prominent, but I think that there's some things to point to. I also try to point out how it has responded to the issues that continue to emerge. And so that's the subtitle of my book, How Accreditation is Changing and Why It Must. One of the tasks that I take on in this book is to describe how the missions of accreditation have proliferated over time. Initially, it was a fairly simple mission. What's a college? What isn't a college? And once the sheep and the goats could be separated, then you could begin to talk about transfer of credit. And so then by definition, an accredited institution was one whose credits would be accepted by another accredited college. But since the second quarter of the 20th century, accreditation has taken on many, many additional missions. And I suggest that in several respects, this growth in the missions has not so much been embraced by accreditation, greatness not achieved but thrust upon them in a sense. The chapter title there is Many Missions, Many Masters. But I do try to distinguish between among core missions, mandated missions, and collateral missions that have developed over time. And I think the literature suggests that as we move from the core to the mandated, to the collateral, they become more and more open to question. To approach the problems that beset accreditation, I examine first the changing environment of higher education itself and issues that have been raised by accreditation's critics, both inside and outside of the academy. I try to explain the most compelling criticisms, some of which have come from this organization, as the platform for an examination of, in order, the three orders of accreditation you've seen on the screen, regional and specialized and national. And I conclude with some recommendations for change according to 6 categories: consensus and alignment as the first, credibility as the second, efficiency, the fourth, agility and creativity, the fifth, decisiveness and transparency, and finally, the need for a compelling shared vision. I'm particularly sensitive to this audience's concern with the interests of governing boards. As a provost for 14 years in 2 different universities, I had the opportunity to become well acquainted with many of the concerns that board members share, not least of those concerning accreditation. You'll not be surprised to learn that the board of my university, having learned about my publication of a book on accreditation, asked me to pay a visit to talk about the book and the recommendations it advances. It's for that reason I'm particularly looking forward to the discussion that will follow the opening presentations. I hope that in my chapters on the 3 forms of accreditation, I have given appropriate credit for the considerable reforms that have in fact been achieved. And one of the problems that I have with some of the criticisms is that some of them anyway suggest a lack of awareness of what is going on inside accreditation. But I join this discussion with the conviction that if further substantive change is not achieved by higher education accreditation, it will be thrust upon accreditation for good or ill. So in some, perhaps contrast with our opening presentation, I think there's a lot that's right about accreditation. And I suggest that as many of you as can find the time to do so, visit one of the annual regional accreditation meetings and sample the innovative energy on display there. I believe also that there's a commitment among accreditation's leaders to become more flexible, more open, more responsive to the public interest. But I believe also that there's a lot of ground that needs to be covered. I think the pace of change is much too slow. And I think that the risks of a leisurely approach to needed reforms has never been higher. Finally, the indictments that are set forth cogently and effectively in the accreditation manual are ones that I recognize. I would express them in a somewhat more nuanced way, perhaps, qualified by an awareness of what has been and is being accomplished, but they do express legitimate concerns requiring address. I also would like to concur with what trustees can do, which is an important element in this pamphlet. But I would add, as Ann Neal suggested earlier, that trustees need to commit themselves to understand accreditation so that when they ask questions, they can ask good questions, and so that when they engage accreditors, they can do so with responses that are credible and constructive.
Paul, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Clara.
Thank you. Is this close enough?
Yes.
Oh, maybe it's, yes. Thank you for being part of this gathering, and thank you, ACTA, for giving me the opportunity to be Scholar-in-Residence this year. I accepted the invitation because there were many issues that ACTA is interested in and advocating for that resonated with me as a faculty member and then dean, provost, and president, and also resonated with me as former trustee of different institutions. Following on what we heard from Rick O'Donnell and from Professor Gaston, I would have to say that from my vantage point, and I am a historian by training, from my vantage point, what we call the accreditation system, it's not a system, it's a network. The network is not necessarily broken. It is still capable of performing the original functions for which it was created, but it has become severely distorted by taking on additional missions, and the distortions are significant enough that we as citizens, not as members of the academy, but as citizens of this country, need to be concerned. There are some red flags out there that I want to talk about. And they have to do with how the accreditors, intentionally or otherwise, encroach on the functions of institutions at the trustees level and at the management level. One short glimpse back to the origins of the accreditation network. If you look at the history of this country, 1 decade before 1900 and roughly another decade or two after 1900, groups of leaders from colleges and universities, typically presidents and trustees, came together with other leading citizens in their communities, in their states, if they were in the public sector, out of a common concern, number one, for the quality of the academic programs that they were offering, for competition that the oldest institutions were experiencing, and for the potentially damaging role in higher education of new players who were less than trustworthy and scrupulous in offering academic programs. Why were they coming together at the turn of the 20th century, last quarter of the 19th, early 20th century? That was also a period of enormous change and expansion in the population of the country, very high rates of immigration, population growth. It was also a time of great expansion and diversification of the American economy. So many of the new players who were coming onto the scene to offer post-secondary programs responded to the opportunities and the needs of that era. So the original founders of the Accreditation Network came together to establish common values that would be clearer to the governing boards of their institutions, would be clearer to the managers of the institutions, and would be clearer to the students who enrolled. The central values were institutional autonomy, no direct government control, even in the public universities that were emerging at that time. The boards would be an intermediate step between the legislature or whoever was in power politically and the institutions. Institutional autonomy, no centralized government control. The second value was institutions, whatever their type of governance or whatever their size, had a responsibility to their students to provide a solid education and to society. Different institutions defined responsibility to society in different ways, that's true, but there was a common understanding that the institutions didn't exist for their own sake, that they served a larger purpose. The third value that was established by those founders was accountability. There had to be a way for trustees themselves and sometimes from outsiders to come to an institution and verify that it was in fact performing its mission. The original system of accountability was simple. It consisted of the president of the school and the trustees inviting in teams of peers from similar institutions in other places who could take a friendly but critical and informed look at what they were doing. What were the visiting teams charged with doing? Again, being friendly, being critical, being informed, and providing information back to their hosts that would help the institution improve. So continued improvement was the goal in a collegial environment where you were evaluated by your peers, but there was one important caveat in this system of friendly, informed visits. Nothing the visiting team said or did was a mandate to the trustees of the institution that invited them or to the president of the institution. It was collegial and advisory. What has happened over time? The founders of this accreditation network, who were living at the turn of the 20th century, would be astonished if they came back today to find that we work in a sector roughly $500 billion annually. Even by the standards of the US economy, that's serious money. They would be even more astonished if they found out that within that sector, something in the order of $150 to $170 billion of federal money flows into the sector annually, much of it in the form of guaranteed loans to students, grants to students. Again, that is serious money. They would, above all, the founders of the accreditation network would be astonished to find out to what extent what started as a peer review, critical but still constructive way of advising institutions became, in fact, a way of prescribing, regulating, mandating. Today, this panel is not a place to explore in depth how these different pieces of the mandate developed over time. Some of us believe that it started with the Higher Education Act way back, maybe even earlier than that. The point is, we are today in an environment in which the accreditors still function as peer reviewers of academic programs, still perform the original function, but that has been submerged and in some cases, I would say, distorted by other things they are doing. Let me give you 4 recent examples that have resulted in a distorted presence by the accreditors. I would even use the word encroachment by the accreditors on the original values for which accreditation was established. For instance, encroachment on the prerogatives of a governing board and of a legislature. An example of where legislators in one important state worked with the governing board appointed by the governor. State of Texas, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, Texas engaged in a significant evaluation of its public universities, what they were doing, how they interacted, which parts of the state were overserved, which parts of the state were underserved, things like that, system-level review. One of the conclusions, supported by the governing board of the system and then by the legislature, enacted by the legislature, was to merge 2 very similar institutions in the southern part of Texas, University of Texas, Brownsville, and Pan American University, both public, 4-year, very similar profile, very similar demographics in terms of enrollment. Again, no need to go into all of the reasons why that decision was made. Let it simply say that it was enacted by the legislature and it was something that the regents of the system had recommended. So it is the merger of the 2 institutions is in progress. Faculty groups from both campuses figure out how to integrate similar programs. All of that is going on. And one day, the management team that is provisionally in charge of the merged institution is told, oh, by the way, both of these campuses have programs in business and in the health sciences, accredited programs. Several specialized accreditors were involved. You cannot simply merge 2 accredited programs. You have to start anew and put in an application to us to have the new entity accredited, which can take, they say, minimum 3 years, but it can take longer depending on how the accreditors evaluate the resources available and the mission, etc. Again, perfectly reasonable action by a governing board, accepted by the campuses, enacted by the legislature. The accreditors do not want to accept the fact that the existing accreditations could be, in effect, transferred or utilized by the new merged entity. Questionable, to say the least, and yet the accreditors were following their own protocols. They were not arbitrarily, deciding to punish the University of Texas system. They were following what their book said they should do. Rick has already given another example of encroachment or inappropriate action by an accreditor, and that is the intervention of the Southern Association of Schools and Colleges at the University of Virginia. I am not going to sit here and defend the method and the processes by which the Board of Visitors of UVA did what it did. It was probably ham-handed, not necessarily wrong, but wrongly managed. Having said that, it is not the role of accreditors to appoint presidents. That was the role of the governing board of the university. The reason why the governing board exists, the primary reason, is to choose, evaluate, and if necessary, fire the CEO. So that intervention was, again, something that the accreditors think is within their purview. And it is something we should challenge, because in fact it isn't. If faculty, students, or other constituencies were not happy with the direction of the university and the performance of the president, there was a governing board. They could express their dissatisfaction, or the reverse. If they supported the president, they could have gone to the board to say so. The governor ultimately would be responsible for what his appointees were doing. Third example, most recently in the news, the very unfortunate situation at the University of North Carolina, involving not only bad behavior in the athletics department, involving also an academic department that was offering degree programs with minimum expectations that the students would do any sort of meaningful work. That's the other side of the coin. It's not encroachment or interference. You have to ask, where were the accreditors? Last time they did an academic review of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. How could they have missed an academic unit that was giving the students degree, preparing them to get degree programs, essentially without a curriculum, without students having to go to class, without any evidence that serious academic work was done? Leave aside the athletics, because we found out as a result of the investigation that many students who were not student athletes were also going through this internal degree mill. Why did that happen? I would guess, based on my experience as the campus president, but also many years of experience as a reviewer for accreditors, Middle States, Sachs, North Central. My guess is that especially in an elite university and a large one like UNC Chapel Hill, the accreditors were too willing to take whatever generic data the administration was preparing and too distracted by other things to ask these fundamental academic questions. So, I think higher education would benefit, all of us would benefit, if we found ways for the accreditors to go back to the original mission for which they were created. And it is a very important mission. And we found other ways for the accountability for Title IV funding to be exercised. In fact, ACTA is preparing a pilot project that we hope to submit to the US Department of Education that would allow institutions that are already regionally accredited, that are in academic and financial good standing, to go through an expedited review focused just on expenditure of Title IV monies, detached from the academic peer review process. I will leave it at that and invite your questions.
Great. Clara, thank you very much. Hank.
Rick, thank you. Thanks for an opportunity to share a few thoughts with everybody. You know, as we think about public issues, we inevitably think about the world the way it is and seldom step back and say, how should it be? it's a different way of looking because it frees you from all the development that's gone on. But what I would like you to do for a moment is think as a public policy person, where you would provide the most rigorous overview of an entity if you were the federal government. One would be an area where you spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and another would be an area where you don't spend anything at all except now and then when people donate to your campaign and you provide a tax credit. Which one would you provide the most rigorous overview? So in thinking about it, what I thought might be helpful is just to take a quick look at how certified public accountants that review and in effect accredit financial reports proceed versus the accreditation process for colleges and universities. And the purpose of it is to give you a feel for where we put emphasis and where we don't, and what the contrasting approaches are. Out of it, I hope will come in your mind some thoughts as to how we might improve or change accreditation. Number one, CPAs, as you know, end up having a written set of rules that tell you what's right and wrong, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, so that the people who are being audited end up knowing or having some clue as to what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong, and what's expected from them. It's a dramatic contrast with accreditors, where the rules are less than crystal clear, I think would be a fair statement, and at times somewhat vague and creative. Number two, the management prepares the financial statements for a private company, as does a university prepare a self-study, or a college prepare a self-study, but there's a big difference. The management of a private company has to certify by law that the statements are correct and complete. And you're open to liability in court for everything you own if it's not complete and accurate. On the public side, the public institution president doesn't have to certify those statements at all. And they can be inaccurate, and other than the public disgrace that may accompany it, there's no consequences. Another area of contrast, CPA firms have rigorous rules that prevent conflict of interest, down to disclosing what their children's college fund might be invested in. With regard to accreditors, the kindest way to describe it would be it is one of the more sophisticated areas of conflict of interest I've ever seen. With regard to the results, CPAs are required to come up with a written report that says exactly what they found and have liability associated for them, personal liability, if what they found is not correct, and to delineate in specific, exact language what it is they objected to or what it is they found to be objectionable. On the contrast, accreditors are not required to give a written description of what they found to be unacceptable at all. And some of you as trustees may have had the pleasure of talking to accreditors after a visit and inquiring why it was that they were put on notice or what the problem was, and the accreditors responding in a number of cases that they're not going to tell you. It's quite a contrast. With regard to CPAs, their reports are made public. By made public, I mean people can read them and get access to them and go through them in detail. With accreditors, many times the findings that they come up with are not made public at all. Their ultimate conclusion may well be public, but the details of what they objected to may not be revealed at all. Not just to the public, but even to the trustees that are with them. With regard to CPAs, it's a competitive enterprise. If a CPA firm is not performing adequately, they can be replaced. With accreditors, it would make John D. Rockefeller pleased with regard to the market position that they have. To describe it as a monopoly is perhaps not exactly precise, but close. What I want to raise in your mind is how differently we have treated this subject, partly because of the background that was explained, but partly because of the way we feel about it. For example, the private sector is blessed with a new regulatory organization now called the PCAOB, Public Accounting Board. And they're kind enough to review CPAs and discipline them and review exactly their work and comment on their work. With regard to accreditors, we do have a system for accrediting accreditors. But interestingly, instead of standards and the ability to review and guide CPAs that we have in the private sector, in the public sector, as part of the statute, there is literally a portion of the statute that says specifically that the Department of Education is not permitted to write guidelines. I'll repeat that. In the statute, for people we give hundreds of billions of dollars to in their accreditation, there is a specific provision, which of course institutions had lobbied for, that prohibits you specifically from the Department of Education issuing guidelines to the accreditors. Now, what's the problem with all of this? Well, some of you who have bias towards the private sector might think it's unfair to treat the private sector more harshly than you do others. Obviously, that's not a commonly held view today, but there is a problem. Imagine for a moment that you're a trustee or a college president or a faculty member that wants to change an institution, wants to increase its productivity, wants to change the curriculum, wants to control cost, a variety of other purposes. In other words, you want change in an institution. What's your major barrier? From my point of view, I believe the major barrier is the accreditation system. Because advocacy of changes on campus have to worry about the possibility that their institution will be put on notice, not because there is a legislative or a specific guideline that they've violated, but because the accreditors may object to the change and withdraw the accreditation or put the institution on notice of withdrawal of accreditation because they don't like the change. I think more than anything, that fact cries out for redressing the situation. To have a barrier to change and improvement in higher education is a travesty. It's a problem and an initiative that we've got to address if we're going to make the progress in higher education that we need.
Great. Hank, thank you very much. We are going to take questions. As you think of your question, I just want to note that ACTA is doing several things on this front to address the issues we've raised here today. Clara talked a little bit about our work to find an alternative way for schools to get access to Title IV that doesn't involve accreditation, so that accreditors can stick to their core mission of quality assurance while having a non-burdensome way to prove quality to the federal government, and we're working on that. Hank alluded to the statute, and we've been working to educate policymakers on how to fix the statute, because one of the effects of that is it in essence gives a blank check to the accrediting agencies. Since the Department of Education can't constrain them to certain functions, accrediting agencies can do whatever they want and sometimes interfere with board trustees. And then thirdly, there are a number of constitutional challenges to accreditation on a variety of grounds, and ACTA is engaged in those, filing amicus briefs and other things to use the courts where appropriate to try and rein in abusive accreditation practices. But I would love to turn it to the audience, and we have questions. Oh, Paul.
I just want to add one qualification. And that has to do with your statement that accrediting agencies can do whatever they want. Accrediting agencies must necessarily respond by law to standards that the Department of Education has developed, and they must regularly apply for recognition by the department in order to operate. This applies to all 3 levels of recognition. And I think that it's important to note that because there is a committee of the department on which Ann Neal sits, the NASIKI, and you sit on that as well. And that has the authority to examine the accreditors and to make recommendations to the department on whether they should enjoy continuing recognition or not. So I think that level of scrutiny deserves attention and ought to be a part of the discussion this afternoon. So, thanks.
Hi, I'm Ashley Thorne at the National Association of Scholars. I wanted to hear your thoughts on accreditors that specify attitudes, values, dispositions that students in the program should have. One that we've seen at the NAS is the value of social justice. That's something that NCATE and the Council on Social Work Education has specified for students.
Does anyone want to take that question?
Oh, sure. Would you like to go first?
I'm not sure. I think I understand your question. I'm not sure whether you're asking is it appropriate for the accreditors to include those criteria? Historically, it has been. In other words, if you go back to the very origins, forget Title IV money and all the things that have happened recently. If you just go back to the history of accreditation, there were very strong value statements about the fact that institutions had an obligation to their students and an obligation to society at large. Those were value statements, and they were interpreted in different ways with different languages, depending on how our society was evolving. So they're not new to the mission of accreditors. You might raise a question about a specific objective or the specific language that is used to describe that objective. But I would say that, again, historically, that has been part of how the work of accreditors was described.
Yeah, I would add, I think Clara's response is spot on, but I would add that disciplinary or specialized accreditors, which is what you're talking about in your question, have been asked by their own members to clarify learning outcomes. And I think that most of us would say that that's a legitimate function of disciplines to agree on what it is that they attempt to teach and develop. Again, with Clara, I would agree that we could take issue with particular statements of outcomes from one discipline to another, but that responsibility
change
and
over time.
the ways in which that responsibility is exercised, I think, is something that has worked fairly well from disciplines from business to acupuncture, and so I would take up with you and support you entirely in your questioning of a particular statement as being difficult to assess, for instance, or difficult to document, but the prerogative of a discipline to define in broad terms its values and its outcomes, I think, is something to be endorsed.
Two thoughts as we approach it. The statute itself lays out standards on which accreditors should look to evaluate an institution. They're fairly limited, and then the statute in effect gives a blank check to look at anything else that the accreditors may want to look at. In addition, there is a restriction in the statute that prohibits the Department of Education from issuing regulations and guidelines in this area as to what they look at. Thus the term blank check, as you look forward to it. So if the question is it legal for accreditors to get involved in the politics of academia? Is it legal for them to end up giving guidance on curriculum? The way the current statute's written, it appears that it is. The other question, I think, is should they? My own inclination is to think when you deal with public money, we should not be in the business of dictating politics. It's not an area that you ought to try and dictate to institutions across the country in terms of the exact tone of the curriculum. Do you need to look at, I think from a policy point of view, the quality of that curriculum? I think so. But in terms of the substance of that curriculum and the details of it, at least from a policy point of view, it would be my sense that they've gone beyond what they ought to be doing.
Great. Thank you. Ann.
I just wanted to add to that the American Council of Trustees and Alumni actually did appear before NASICI and opposed the certification of NCATE because of its requirement of a social justice obligation. It was our sense that this was indeed well beyond the statutory responsibility of accreditors, who are to ensure educational quality, and that the advocacy of social justice had nothing to do with that. So we very much opposed this and urged them not to certify them. Regrettably, they did go ahead at that time to certify them, but we were on record, as was Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Sir, yeah.
It's not clear for me, knowing nothing before today's event about accreditation and how it works, whether if we would start from scratch, we would eliminate the whole thing. I wonder whether you might comment on that.
I would point to a couple of things. One is that our model of accreditation based on peer review is one that is increasingly being referenced by nations around the world that have instead a tradition of governance through ministries and other federal boards, because it, for the most part, I believe, has worked well. To take it back to a blank page and to begin anew, I think might be a useful exercise to perform, at least in the abstract. But I believe that it would lead to that question about being careful what we hope for, because the strength of the criticisms of accreditation, I think, really must lie in the specificity of the alternatives that are being proposed. And so far, those alternatives seem to be more cumbersome, to be less responsive to the public interest, and to be enormously more expensive than the present system. One virtue of the present system.
There was none at all.
I'm sorry?
Unless there was none at all. Why can't the faculties, assuming they know what they're doing, run their own college? Why didn't other faculty members, other colleges, tell them how they're doing? You don't need anything at all.
Okay, that's one interesting position.
Yeah. Well, you know, at one extreme you might say forget any sort of outside review. I don't think that would be particularly advantageous. When I think of corporate boards on which I have served over the years, we weren't required to have outsiders come in and look at our goals or our operations. The directors typically, and the management team typically welcomed some examples perhaps from companies that worked in the same sector, or from retired CEOs of other companies who had a sense of what we were about and how we were going to achieve our goals. It was useful to have that kind of advice. However, it was mostly voluntary, unpaid. It was voluntary. It was mostly unpaid. And it was advisory to those who invited the team or the individual to come in and provide advice. I think that higher education would benefit greatly by maintaining the original concept of a truly voluntary peer review by people from other institutions who can come in and, at your request, look at what you're doing, give you their best professional judgment, without mandating whether or not you're going to change the way you do things, just purely voluntary and advisory. The problem with what has happened to our elaborate network, and notice I don't want to use the word system because we don't have a system. The problem with our cumbersome, big, expensive network is that it is no longer based on voluntary peer review. That's only a slice of what it does. It has taken on all of these other enforcement involuntary functions. Institutions no longer choose to be accredited. You have to be accredited in order to have access to federal funding. In fact, you need to be accredited by one of the regionals generally before you become eligible for specialized accreditation. So it's no longer voluntary. And moreover, as an institution, you cannot choose which one of the regional accreditors you belong to. That happens to be an accident of geography. If your main base of operations is Iowa, you know, you're going to be in the North Central. It doesn't matter what you may prefer to do. But the original, I would also argue that the original core of accreditation, and that is the voluntary peer review for purposes of helping you improve your programs and improve your institutions, is as important now as it was a century ago, if not more.
Couple quick thoughts. First of all, I would agree. The concept of accreditation as a voluntary institution obviously has validity, and people should be allowed to participate in that if they wish. If, though, as I think you'll find Congress does, is Congress is going to say, look, if we're going to give hundreds of billions of dollars to higher education, we are going to have some standards to make sure that minimum levels of accreditation are met. Here are the things that I would think should guide that. First of all, the accreditation system it stands ought to be allowed to continue, but not be the gatekeeper. With regard to a gatekeeper, it would seem to me the following aspects have some value. One, institutions like Yale and Harvard and Columbia all have outstanding reputations. There's no question that they have problems, but no question that they have the academic quality. So what I would hope we would have is the threshold is a set of disclosures that are pretty basic, that if someone meets those disclosures and meets those basic standards, that they no longer require additional gatekeeping. We already collect the financial information. We already have that material available. The Department of Education collects it and has it. So that there's a range of institutions that don't need to spend $1 million or $2 million to entertain accreditors periodically. For the others, and there's many others as we've talked about, you ought to have a system of gatekeeping, I think, that involves these clear standards. One, there ought to be clear written standards so you know what the standard is. Two, there ought to be procedures that rise above the level of the Spanish Inquisition. That is, you are entitled to know if you don't meet the standard where you failed. It shouldn't be a secret. It shouldn't be only the people on the inside know about it. The current standard, I think, as you know now, literally you can fail an accreditation visit, and they don't have to tell you where you were short. And often, some of the creditors simply don't as a policy. So, one, clear standards. Two, an openness with regard to what the shortcoming was in a written report of some sort. But we ought to revert in a circumstance like this to common sense. Congress is not going to give away hundreds of billions of dollars. Well, they're unlikely to give away hundreds of billions of dollars without some gatekeeping function. But the gatekeeping function should be transparent and should be clear.
Thank you, Hank. Yeah, when I oversaw the higher ed system in Colorado, one of the things we did was regulate private schools. And if you want to make a politician nervous, have a front page story that state money is going to diploma mills. And they will promptly figure out a way to try and stop that when tax dollars are involved.
One other thing I hope the statute will include is a provision that in determining academic quality, that the accreditors or whatever gatekeeping function you designate does not have the ability to override state law with regard to governance issues. Yeah. What we have now is a system where state law will assign a responsibility to trustees or regents to run an institution from a governance point of view, and the accreditors will come in and assume the ability to override state law and the trustees. To me, that's a great mistake in governance matters.
Hank, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want you to know that ACTA will continue to fight for improvements in the accreditation and gatekeeping system and to protect the rights of trustees. And please join me in thanking our panel this afternoon.